Hello everyone, Dominic here again. Today I'm going to be making a shorter version of my Tower of Babel video because it is over 2 hours long and I do a lot of reading and exposition. So I'm going to be condensing down the important things from the video and demonstrating that the Tower of Babel was indeed a real place based off of real buildings, mirroring real events and real people. It is a historical narrative poetically describing what happens when a ruler centralizes authority according to their own metrics and systems, while everyone else is forced to conform to those systems, lest they have war or some other form of coercion brought down upon them. So this image right here is the definitive proof that the Tower of Babel was a real place called Edamananke, which this depicts Nebuchadnezzar, who built, or I should say rebuilt it in the 500s BC. And we're going to read that inscription. This is what the translation says. Edamananke Ziggurat Babili, the house, the foundation of heaven and earth. Ziggurat in Babylon. Caption identifying the great ziggurat of Babylon, the Tower of Babel. The royal inscription of Nebuchadnezzar continues. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, am I. In order to complete Edamananke and Irme-Mananke, I mobilized all countries everywhere. Each and every ruler had been raised to prominence over all the people of the world, loved by Marduk, from the upper sea to the lower sea, the distant nations, the teeming of people of the world, kings of remote mountains and far-flung islands. The base I filled with a high terrace. I built their structures with bitumen and baked bricks throughout. I completed it, raising it to its top, to heaven, making it gleam as bright as the sun. So, first thing I'm going to draw attention to are the names here, Edamananke and Irme-Mananke. So there's actually two towers of Babel. There's one in Babylon, built by the capital city in honor of the god Marduk. And there's another one in the city of Borsippa called Irme-Mananke, built in honor of the god Marduk's son, Nabu, who is the god of writing. Now, in a more complete translation of this, because this is very damaged and hard to get a accurate translation of, but in my other video I provide a more complete translation of the same thing, just found in Borsippa instead. This one was found in Babylon. It goes on about how he built it in honor of the previous king and the previous king of the god, which this website does describe the previous king here as Hammurabi, who built the original ziggurat around 792 to 750 BC. So it took about 42 years of work for Hammurabi to complete it, and 43 years for Nebuchadnezzar to complete his ziggurat. And these two ziggurats are essentially just mirroring one another, because Borsippa is the sister city of Babylon, where you have the father god ruling in conjunction with the sun god, symbolized by the tower, which are meant to, as it says here, serve as the house and the foundation of heaven and earth, by serving as the house of the gods themselves. So, here's what Irme-Mananke would have looked like, or I'm sorry, Edamananke would have looked like during Nebuchadnezzar's time. It would have been about a little under 100, or a little over 100 feet. I think it would have been about 150 feet tall. And it's very big. It's supposedly, I think, the biggest brick building ever constructed. And then here is the remnants of the other tower, Irme Menanke in Borsippa, which has vitrified remains from an internal fire. So these towers were built by kings who are essentially symbolically represented by the archetypal figure in the Bible, Nimrod. Nimrod is described as the hunter, the mighty hunter before God. And he's essentially a hunter of humans and city-states, because in order to have a powerful centralized city, you have to have people under your rule. And in my video, I point out 3 people who serve as a strong foundation for Nimrod. However, I also point out that Nimrod is an amalgamation of many historical characters rolled into one to represent the archetype of an authoritarian who unifies the land or even the world under essentially a one world government or a one world order. And the people I named specifically for that were Enmerkar, Sargon of Akkad, and Hammurabi. All 3 of these people fit the description of Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, who organized the people according to one speech. But there's other people as well. And here in this picture is Naram Sin, who's of the lineage of Sargon, who is the first Mesopotamian ruler to declare himself personally a god. So he's not just serving the gods, he is a god. And notice how he's depicted here, standing over his enemies who are defeated, with people looking up to him as this colossal figure. So Naram Sin is another one of these Nimrod types who literally declared himself God. And there are also other people such as Ur-Nammu. Now, a lot of people will point to Sargon as the biblical Nimrod. And while I do agree with that, Sargon himself did not build any ziggurats under his rule, nor do I think he ordered the construction of any ziggurats. He was constantly having to put down rebellions and war within his own kingdom. However, the ruler Ur-Nammu, who ruled from the city of Ur after he put down the ruler of Lagash and ended the Lagash period, ended up building a ziggurat, and he ended up, along with his son Shulgi, these two, ordered a new type of language system, a new type of universal language in the form of weights. So when the central city who was in charge would demand tribute, they would do it according to scales and weights and measurements. They would give a certain amount of shekels or cubits, which weighed like, however many pounds. But the thing was that amongst the different city-states, a shekel was different. 1 shekel may have been less and 1 shekel may have been more in a city like Gersu versus a city like Kish. So what Ur-Nammu did from his capital of Ur was instituted a standardized weight system so that all those city-states and their standards of measurements conformed to the centralized city that was ruling during the time. And so the language that's being described in the Bible, when they say that they were united under one language, is simply a metaphor for compartmentalized knowledge in the form of writing, in the form of weight measurements, in the form of geometry, and in the form of astrology. used by the aristocrats to coordinate the ruling class under their rule. So the unifying language was writing, pretty much. It was writing, which during the period, it's described that all of the transactions in the empire were processed and written down and sent through the centralized authority or some type of authority. Essentially, nothing escaped the sight of However, this was seen as like a two-way thing because the city-states were seen as giving the city of their own blessing in order to do this, to make ruling for the gods easier. So this is what Nimrod symbolizes. However, he would most closely resemble Hammurabi, who would have been pretty much the first ruler to institute a law system, not that anyone else didn't before, but he instituted a universal law system that pretty much overrode or overwritten all the law systems of the other city-states, which, just like Namu, who came before him, standardizing the weights, was unprecedented. And at the same time, Hammurabi himself would have had the two ziggurats, one in Babylon and one in Borsippa, the father-son god paralleling each other in the sister cities. Nabu, the god of writing, this is where his law system would have been blessed from, this city, Borsippa. So now we're going to look at Genesis. We're going to read Genesis and figure out what's going on here. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech, and it came to pass, and they journeyed from the east, that they found the plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And Shinar is Iraq, Mesopotamia. And they said to one another, Go, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach the heaven. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered upon the face of the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it is called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of the earth, and from thence the Lord did scatter them abroad the face of the earth. Okay, so just for the record, what's being described in this stele, the baked bricks throughout, and it also describes bitumen as well in the other translation, perfectly matches the biblical or in Genesis account. So this does prove that the tower was a real building. However, what's being described here is multiple events in one story. So, as I described, during ancient Mesopotamia, from the time of Sargon through the time of Hammurabi, you have a land that has many different languages. They're very diverse. And so they're trying to figure out how to unify them continuously from the time period between Sargon and Hammurabi. And the way they do this is by the written language, which was invented around 3500 BC. They use the written language to make the people obey the standards of the central authority, who themselves are trained in the way of the language, while the people who are out working the fields, for example, they can't read the cuneiform. They don't understand the astrology. So something happens to Babylon that disrupts their control and monopoly that they had over this language. So by the time you get to Neo-Babylon, which is when this is written, the people who were the slaves, basically, they were literate. They were being exposed to these myths. And what they did was essentially beat Babylon at their own game. They took the myths, they made them their own, and they used them against Babylon as a sort of like anti-propaganda move. And that's essentially what this Tower of Babel story is, describing ancient Babylon and their failed ways. And now the writers of this story would be seeing Neo-Babylon over 1,000 years later, repeating the same ways, but not being fooled the way the people were in ancient Babylon. Now they understood the language of the ruling class, and they take that language and they make their own myths based off of their myths. And now it's the Abrahamic accounts that are remembered and not the Mesopotamian accounts. So physically, they're describing the Neo-Babylonian period, but they're capturing the essence of the ancient Babylonian period and putting that into their writings, which essentially is just mirroring itself during the Neo-Babylonian time, because during that time, they're trying to redo the ways of the old, but failing. So what's happening here is you have the writers of Genesis describing the time of the Neo-Babylonians, adopting their mythology, and essentially saying nothing's changed in Babylon. You know, just in the old times, they ended up scattering. They did end up scattering because there's a time after Hammurabi's time period, about 200 years after he rules, Babylon goes into this dark age where there's just essentially no writing, no record keeping, and not much history being recorded. And this was from about the 1500s through the 1400s. So it's entirely geopolitical, and it's even reflected in the Bible because Daniel is living during Nebuchadnezzar's time, and Daniel himself basically understands the Babylonian myths and can translate the king's dreams better than the Babylonian priests can, which just shows that the people in Babylon, the slaves in Babylon and the peasants there, they were ahead of the Babylonians themselves, which wasn't the case in ancient times, because they're repeating the same old ways, but now the people have caught on, and they're beating them at those ways. And this is why Babylon basically fell. But because these people adopted the same ways of Babylon, which is just using mythology to describe the world, they've kind of locked themselves into the same thinking and the same ways of living that Babylon did. So they defeated the nation Babylon, but in a sense, Babylon just transformed. And here's the image of the Tower of Babel. And what is happening at the Tower of Babel, really? The whole purpose of the ziggurat within ancient Mesopotamia is to serve as a fixed location in tune with the stars. So that way, as the seasons move and the stars patterns change in the sky, there's a fixed point telling the city when it is aligned with what stars and constellations. And this tells them when to coordinate their labor, when to focus on what building projects, and how to maximize the value and the labor of the people who live under the city-state. So all it serves as is basically a big clock. That's the purpose of the ziggurat. As well as Mesopotamia is very, very flat. So you would have seen these things from miles away. And it just also symbolizes the power of the city. But where does the power of the city come from? It comes from the people who actively put in the work to power the city. The agricultural work, the work of storing the food, the work of trading the products, the work of building monuments like this and other construction projects, and the work of waging war and defending the city's interests from potential invaders. What this does is it equates people's value to their output and what they're contributing to the city-state, which is what Babylon was all about. They had beliefs that their gods blessed them with the greatest city and the greatest land to rule over. And their whole purpose was maintaining the status quo that their gods put in place for them. And these ziggurats would be full of idols, whether it's gold or silver or other metals, that the people would channel their energy towards, and the ziggurat itself. And these idols were basically there to contain the psychic energy and the thought patterns of the people. So the city was not just harvesting the physical labor of the people. They were actively harvesting the beliefs and the thoughts they had about the world, while engineering and orchestrating those thoughts to conform to the standards of the city. And so the gods of Babylon, like Marduk or whoever, all these are names for the beliefs of the people of the city, channeled into one centralized location that the city-state's ruler can take advantage of and use as his divine authority to rule over the people. It's the people's channeled belief into one point that is the divine authority of the kings of Mesopotamia. And Nimrod himself, as I state in my other video, is basically just a person, or he's an archetypal character who realizes that human beings' thoughts create patterns and energies that move people in a way that can be controlled. And he saw the civilizations around him as weak and dependent on these thought patterns and susceptible to a cataclysm, because the Tower of Babel was built to protect them against a flood. So he saw this weakness, Nimrod, and decided to take it for himself and steer the attention and the thought patterns of the people the direction he wanted to guide them. Because in his mind, his will was the strongest, his desires were the strongest, and everyone else was weak. And he did not want people to be weak. So he thought if he could use his strength to guide these people towards a place and a level where he was at, humanity would eventually grow into a strong species. But all Nimrod did, by attempting to take control of the people and by viewing them as weak and treating them as they're weak, was make them more weak and dependent on the systems than ever before, as seen with the Akkadian Empire, which is a memory that lived on in Mesopotamia ever since it was established. they remember all their history, but there was nothing like the Akkadian Empire before or after, in the sense that when they first centralized the land, it was the most traumatizing, perhaps, experience that the people had from a government in Mesopotamia. Now, they had lots of cataclysms that were also traumatizing, and I would say that the Sargon Empire is like a trauma-based reaction to these cataclysms in an attempt to protect man from them. But in doing so, all he did was just make us more susceptible to being ruled by authoritarians. And he spent a lot of time, Sargon, putting down rebellions. People did not like his rule, but still, his system would be the dominant system moving forward, one of centralized authority, and everyone trying to reclaim what he had. So this is what the Tower of Babel is ultimately about. It's about a tower that serves as a symbol for the beliefs of the people who are united under this idea that they all belong to the city-state, they all belong to the God who represents the city-state, and their labor is nothing more than an appeasement or a sacred duty to uphold the nature of the city-state, which, as we saw with the Nebuchadnezzar scroll, serves as the foundation between heaven and earth. But it is ultimately a false foundation and can only lead to disaster in the end. So that's my shorter version of the Tower of Babel. And I'll see you guys again.